The champagne glass slipped from Ethan's hand, shattering against the marble floor, just as he announced to our entire wedding party that he'd never truly loved me. 200 pairs of eyes turned toward us, synchronized like a professional dance troupe. And in that moment, I realized that the carefully crafted illusion I had been living in had just crumbled as dramatically as that $50 crystal flute. Hello, beautiful people. Before we dive into this story, help us hit 1,000 subscribers. Let's get right into it. I had always prided myself on being pragmatic, working as a financial analyst at one of New York's top firms. I built my career on assessing risks and predicting outcomes. Yet somehow I had failed to recognize the warning signs in my own relationship. Ethan Matthews was everything I thought I wanted: successful, charming, and from the kind of old money family that my immigrant parents had always viewed with a blend of admiration and suspicion. Our engagement, after 8 months of dating, had made headlines in the society pages, something my mother had framed and proudly displayed in their living room. The signs had been there, of course, in the way Ethan would check his phone during our dates, in his growing irritability as the wedding day drew closer, and in the late nights at the office that seemed to coincide with his executive assistant's schedule. I dismissed it all as pre-wedding jitters and work stress. After all, merging the Hawthorne Hotel empire with my financial expertise made perfect sense on paper. Love was just a bonus, wasn't it? At least that's what I told myself during the nights when Ethan's side of the bed remained empty until dawn. "You've outdone yourself, Emily," Chloe whispered, squeezing my arm as we walked through the rehearsal venue. The Hawthorne Estate Gardens had been transformed with thousands of white orchids and crystal chandeliers suspended from century-old oak trees. This was going to be the wedding of the year. I nodded, scanning the crowd for Ethan. He had disappeared shortly after we arrived, mumbling something about greeting important guests. "Have you seen Ethan?" I asked, trying to keep the edge of concern from my voice. Chloe smiled and tightened her grip on my arm. "I think he's with Ryan by the East Fountain," she said. She hesitated before adding, "Emily, are you sure about this?" I forced a laugh. "Just nerves. You know me, I like having everything under control." The irony of those words would return to haunt me just hours later, as I made my way through the clusters of guests. I caught sight of a man I recognized but hadn't expected to see. David Hawthorne stood alone near the Rose Garden, observing the proceedings with an inscrutable expression. His presence was surprising, given the notorious rivalry between his family's boutique hotel chain and the Hawthorne empire. Their competition had turned particularly vicious in recent months, with Ethan leading an aggressive expansion that directly threatened Hawthorne properties in 3 cities. "Mr. Hawthorne," I said, approaching him with professional courtesy. "I wasn't aware you were on the guest list." His eyes, a startling shade of blue, met mine with unexposed warmth. "Ms. Carson, congratulations on your engagement," he said, offering a smile that seemed almost sad. "Ethan and I may be competitors, but our families go back generations. Some traditions transcend business." Something in his tone made me pause. "Well, I appreciate you coming. It's a testament to your character that you can separate business from personal matters." The words felt hollow, even as I spoke them. David studied me for a moment, longer than was comfortable. "I've always found that the personal and professional are inevitably intertwined, especially in families like the Hawthornes," he said quietly. He glanced over my shoulder, his expression shifting. "Speaking of which, your fiancé seems to be looking for you." I turned to see Ethan striding toward us, his face flushed with what I assumed was anger. His hand gripped my elbow, possessive as he reached us. "Hawthorne!" he spat. "I'm surprised you had the nerve to show up." David remained unruffled. "I never miss an important social occasion, Ethan. You know that." His eyes flickered to me briefly. "Your fiancé was just graciously welcoming me." Ethan's fingers tightened on my arm. "We need to go, Emily. The wedding planner is looking for us." He practically pulled me away, not bothering to say goodbye. "What was that about?" I asked when we were out of earshot. "He was just being polite," Ethan muttered, but I could see the tension in his jaw. Hawthorne is never just anything. Everything he does has an agenda. He checked his phone for the third time in as many minutes. "Look, I need to take this call. Just stay away from him, all right?" Before I could respond, he was gone again, leaving me standing alone among 100 conversations that didn't include me. The wedding planner was nowhere in sight. Another lie. They were accumulating faster than I could process them. The rehearsal dinner began at sunset. Crystal and silver reflected the golden light as waiters circulated with trays of champagne and canapes. I sat beside Ethan at the head table, acutely aware of the space between us, despite our touching shoulders. His attention was focused on his phone beneath the table. Ryan stood to give the first toast, his words a blur of prep school references, inside jokes and bachelor party anecdotes that made my parents shift uncomfortably in their seats. When it was Ethan's turn to speak, he rose slowly, swaying slightly. I hadn't noticed how much he had been drinking. "I want to thank everyone for coming," he began, his words slightly slurred. "Especially those who traveled far to be here. It means a lot to the Hawthorne family to maintain these traditions." His gaze drifted to where David Hawthorne sat quietly, observing. Something passed between them, but I couldn't interpret it. "You know, everyone keeps asking me how I got so lucky to find someone like Emily," Ethan continued, placing a hand on my shoulder that felt more like a weight than a caress. "The truth is," he laughed, a sound without humor, "the truth is, luck had nothing to do with it." A warning bell sounded in my head. I placed my hand over his, trying to guide him back to his seat, but he shook me off. "Strategy. That's what it was. Isn't that right, Hawthorne?" Ethan called across the room. "You understand strategy." David didn't respond, but I saw concern flash across his face. Not for Ethan, for me. I proposed to Emily exactly 3 days after I learned Hawthorne was planning to expand into the Asian market. Ethan's voice had grown louder, more reckless. Having a financial analyst with her connections in hand was just good business. The room fell silent. Even the waiters froze in place. "Ethan," I whispered, horrified, "you're drunk. Sit down." He looked down at me, and I saw something cruel in his eyes, something I'd never noticed before, or perhaps had chosen not to see. "Did you really think someone like me would marry someone like you for love?" The champagne glass tilted in his hand, his voice carrying a bitterness that seemed out of place. "Got the look on your face. You did, didn't you?" The glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the floor. In the silence that followed, 200 guests heard him say the words that would end our engagement and begin something I could never have anticipated. "I never loved you, Emily. It was always just business." I didn't cry until I was alone in the hotel suite. Not when Ethan stormed out after his drunken confession. Not when my mother rushed to my side, her face a mask of concern and embarrassment. Not even when Chloe helped me gather my things and quietly whisked me away from the Hawthorne estate. Whispers followed us like a trail of breadcrumbs, but the moment the hotel room door clicked shut behind me, the dam broke. I kicked off my designer heels, chosen, specifically to complement Ethan's height for our wedding photos, and collapsed onto the king-sized bed in a heap of expensive fabric and shattered dreams. My phone buzzed incessantly, messages from concerned friends, frantic family members, and worst of all, reporters who had somehow already caught wind of the society wedding disaster of the year. I silenced it without looking at a single notification and hurled it across the room. It landed with a soft thud on the plush carpet, still intact. Even my attempts at destruction were failures tonight. 32 years old and back to square one, I whispered to the empty room. The humiliation burned worse than the betrayal I had built my professional reputation on, being shrewd, perceptive, and impossible to fool. Yet Ethan had played me like an amateur. And not just Ethan. His entire family must have been in on it. The business merger, the Asian market expansion, the calculated timing of our relationship milestones. How long had they been laughing behind my back? How many people had known I was just a pawn on their corporate chessboard? I dragged myself to the bathroom and stared at my reflection. My carefully applied makeup remained perfect despite everything, an absurdity that only intensified my sense of helplessness. I scrubbed my face violently with a hotel washcloth, erasing the contours and highlights that had taken an hour to apply. My bare face stared back at me, vulnerable and raw. I barely recognized myself. A knock at the door startled me. "Housekeeping," came the soft voice from the hallway. "No, thank you," I called back, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. "Actually," the reply came, "I have reinforcements." I trudged to the door and opened it to find Chloe, holding a bottle of expensive champagne in one hand and a pint of ice cream in the other. I couldn't decide which cliché was more appropriate, so I brought both, she said, pushing past me into the room. Despite everything, I felt the corner of my mouth twitch upward. Champagne seems counterproductive, given what happened. "This isn't for celebration," Chloe replied, setting the items down and searching for glasses. "It's for reclamation. We're taking back champagne from that asshole." I sank onto the edge of the bed. "How bad is it out there?" Chloe hesitated, which told me everything I needed to know. "Ryan is doing damage control, claiming Ethan was drunk and didn't mean it." I laughed bitterly. "Isn't that the worst part? That everyone thinks I need protecting from the truth? That poor, naive Emily couldn't possibly have known she was being used?" "No one thinks that," Chloe said firmly, handing me a glass. "Everyone is. Appalled at Ethan, not pitying you." I shook my head. "My mother's face," I said, the memory still fresh and painful. She looked so disappointed, not in Ethan, in me, for choosing him. "Your mother will recover," Chloe replied, "and so will you, though Ethan might not when I'm done with him." She raised her glass, and I clinked mine against hers, though I couldn't bring myself to drink. The bubbles reminded me too much of the moment everything had fallen apart. Instead, I sat down and reached for my phone, scrolling through the barrage of notifications. 3 missed calls from my parents, 7 from the wedding planner, probably frantic about cancellations, 1 from Ethan himself, which I deleted without listening to, and a text message from a number I didn't recognize. "I know this is intrusive, but I'd like to speak with you. It's important. David Hawthorne." I showed the message to Chloe, whose eyebrows shot up. "David Hawthorne? The hot one who was watching you all night?" "He wasn't watching me," I said automatically, then paused. Had he been? "He probably just wants to offer condolences or something." Chloe checked the timestamp. 11:30 at night? Not likely. She studied me carefully. "Are you going to respond?" I stared at the message. Under normal circumstances, I would have ignored it. But nothing about tonight had been normal, and something about David's measured concern during the disaster had stuck with me. "Maybe. I don't know." "Do it," Chloe urged. "What have you got to lose at this point?" She had a point. I typed back a simple reply. "I'm at the Regal downtown, room 1214. Chloe's eyes widened. "Well, that was direct." I shrugged. "Like you said, what have I got to lose?" I pulled on the hotel's plush robe over my wrinkled rehearsal dinner dress. No longer caring about appearances. 20 minutes later, a soft knock came at the door. Chloe squeezed my arm. "I'll be in the bathroom if you need backup," she whispered, disappearing with her champagne. I opened the door to find David Hawthorne, standing in the hallway, still dressed in his rehearsal dinner suit, but with his tie loosened and top button undone. He looked tired, but nothing like the wreck I knew. "I appear to be mistaken," he said, his voice low. "Thank you for seeing me. I know this is unorthodox." "Everything about today has been unorthodox, Mr. Hawthorne," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. "Considering my fiancé publicly humiliated me in front of you a few hours ago, I think we can drop the formalities." He entered cautiously, taking in the scene, the discarded shoes, the untouched champagne, my tear-stained face. "Emily," he said, his voice soft. "Then it's David," I replied, too exhausted for pleasantries. "What do you want, David? If you've come to offer sympathy, thank you, but it's not necessary." He shook his head. "I haven't come for that, though you have it all the same." He hesitated, then pulled out a folded document from his jacket. "I came to tell you that what Ethan said about the timing of your engagement wasn't a drunken fabrication. It was true." I felt a fresh wave of humiliation wash over me. "You came here at midnight to tell me I was indeed used as a business pawn. Thanks, but I got that message pretty clearly already." "No," he said quickly. "I came to tell you that you weren't the only one he was playing." He unfolded the document, handing it to me. 3 days before he proposed to you, the Hawthorne Group initiated a hostile takeover attempt of Matthews Hotels. They've been buying up shares through shell companies for months. I scanned the paper, skimming the financial jargon that was all too familiar to me. "And you think he pursued me too? What, distract me with wedding gossip while he undermined your company?" David nodded. "That, and to gain access to your client portfolio in Asia. You're respected in financial circles that even the Matthews name can't penetrate." I sank onto the edge of the bed, processing this new information. So this wasn't just about me, it was about him too. "Daniel has always been competitive to the point of destruction," David continued, sitting down in the armchair opposite me. "We were at boarding school together. His need to win, to dominate. It's pathological." "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "What do you want from me?" David leaned forward, his blue eyes intense. "I have a proposition for you, Emily. One that would solve both our problems." I stared at him, trying to process his words. "A proposition?" "Marry me instead," he said simply, his gaze unwavering. "Tomorrow. Same venue, same guests, different groom." I blinked, certain I'd misheard. "You're joking." "I'm completely serious," he replied. "Think about it. Ethan publicly humiliated you. Walking away quietly means everyone will pity you forever. But showing up tomorrow with me instead, that's a power move. Ethan will never recover from it." I stared at him, trying to make sense of the absurdity of the situation. And what do you get out of this insanity? The Matthews takeover relies on investor confidence, which is tied to the merger with your family's connections. If you marry me instead, their entire strategy collapses, he explained, his voice calm and measured. Plus, Ethan losing you to me specifically would destroy him personally and professionally. I laughed, the sound bordering on hysterical. "You're actually serious?" "Completely," David confirmed, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It would be a business arrangement, of course. We can set terms, a timeline, everything. I'm not looking for a real marriage." From the bathroom doorway, Chloe's voice interrupted. "Holy shit, you should do it." She stepped into the room, not even pretending she hadn't been eavesdropping. David looked startled by her sudden appearance, but recovered quickly. "Your friend sees the potential," he said, looking at Chloe. "My friend is drunk on revenge," I retorted. "Champagne?" But my mind was racing. The audacity of it. The perfect symmetry of turning Ethan's scheme back on him. It was madness, of course. But as the night wore on and David outlined his proposal in more detail, a strange clarity began to emerge from the chaos of my emotions. By dawn, as the first light filtered through the hotel curtains, I found myself nodding. "All right," I said, surprising even myself. "Let's do it. Let's get married." The next 12 hours passed in a surreal blur of activity. David left at dawn with a handshake that felt oddly formal, given that we'd just agreed to marry each other. He promised to handle the logistics while I broke the news to my family. Chloe, still buzzing with champagne-fueled righteousness, immediately appointed herself my co-conspirator. "This isn't just revenge," she insisted as we plodded over room service coffee. "It's justice. Cosmic justice." I wasn't sure I believed in cosmic justice, but there was something undeniably satisfying about the symmetry of it all. The ultimate power move, turning Ethan's own scheme back on him with a twist he'd never see coming. My parents took the news, better than I expected, perhaps because I presented it as a strategic business decision rather than an emotional reaction. My father, ever practical, simply nodded and asked about David's financials. My mother, who had been bracing herself to comfort a heartbroken daughter, seemed relieved to find me clear-eyed and determined instead. "Just tell me one thing," she said, leaning in closely. "Is this what you really want?" I couldn't answer that honestly. I didn't know what I wanted anymore, but I knew what I didn't want: to be pitied, to be the woman left at the altar while Ethan triumphed. So I nodded, and that was enough for her. David's team worked with terrifying efficiency. By noon, they had secured the venue, the same exclusive garden estate where Ethan and I were supposed to marry, and contacted all the vendors. The wedding planner nearly had a stroke when I called to inform her of the change, but the prospect of salvaging her fee and reputation won out over her shock. "But the place cards, the monogram napkins, the custom cake topper," she wailed. I told her to burn them. David's assistant arranged for a judge who owed the Hawthorne family a favor to perform the ceremony, and new rings were being rushed from a jeweler across town. The most surreal part of all was trying on my wedding dress, the same one I'd spent months selecting for my marriage to Ethan. Chloe zipped me into the delicate lace and silk with reverent hands. "You should burn this too," she suggested, but I shook my head. It was a beautiful dress, and I'd chosen it for me, not for him. Besides, there was no time to find another. "It fits you even better today," Chloe observed. "Must be all the emotional baggage you've shed last night." She was right. I stood straighter, unencumbered by the constant need to mold myself into Ethan's ideal partner. At 2 p.m., just 6 hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, I finally met with David again. He arrived at my hotel suite, looking immaculate in a tailored suit that wasn't quite formal enough to be wedding attire. His team followed with stacks of documents and a laptop. "We need to establish the parameters," he explained as his lawyers set up at the desk. "This has to be airtight to work effectively." I appreciated his directness. No pretense, no false romance, just a clean business arrangement. We agreed on a 1-year term, joint public appearances for credibility, and a prenuptial agreement that protected both our assets. We would maintain separate residences but share his penthouse for appearances' sake. At the 6-month mark, we would reassess. "And if either of us wants out earlier?" I asked. He smiled, the first crack in his professional demeanor. "Let's at least give Ethan a few months to suffer first." At 4 p.m., my makeup artist and hairstylist arrived. They had been informed of the change in plans, but not the full details. Their eyes widened when they saw David leaving my suite, but to their credit, they asked no questions. As they worked, I felt strangely calm. The numbness from last night had been replaced by a cool determination. This wasn't about love, or even primarily about revenge. It was about reclaiming the narrative. For once, I would be the one making the calculated move, not the one being calculated against. At 6 p.m., Chloe helped me into the vintage Rolls-Royce that had been arranged to take us to the venue. "Last chance to back out," she said, searching my face for doubt. I shook my head. I've never been more sure of an insane decision in my life. The driver, discreet and professional, gave no indication that he was aware of the changes to the original plan. As we pulled away from the hotel, I noticed a small commotion at the entrance. Reporters had gotten wind that something unusual was happening with the Carson-Hawthorne wedding. Good. Let them speculate. They'd have their answers soon enough. The estate looked transformed in the evening light, strung with thousands of twinkling lights that reflected in the ornamental ponds. Guests were already arriving, their confusion palpable as they presented invitations to bemused staff. I waited in the bridal suite. the same one I'd expected to use when marrying Ethan. Chloe kept me updated on the gossip, filtering back from the gathering crowd. "Ethan's parents just arrived," she whispered gleefully. "They look like they've been sucking lemons." My own parents were greeting guests with practiced grace, as if switching grooms was the most natural thing in the world. At 7:30 p.m., the wedding planner knocked tentatively at the door. "It's time," she said, clearly still processing the day's events. "Mr. Hawthorne is waiting at the altar." I took a final look in the mirror. The woman who gazed back at me looked poised, almost regal in her ivory lace. She betrayed none of the turmoil of the past 24 hours. Good. I gathered my bouquet, white orchids just as planned, and followed the coordinator to the garden entrance. The music began. Not the traditional wedding march, but a string quartet playing something classical and dignified, something David had selected. I rounded the corner and saw the assembled guests. Their faces were a mixture of confusion, shock, and, in some cases, delighted scandal. And there at the altar stood David Hawthorne in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, his expression giving nothing away except a small, almost imperceptible nod of reassurance. I began my walk down the aisle, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other, blocking out the whispers and the stunned gazes. But then a commotion erupted at the back of the gathering. Ethan Westbrook, his hair disheveled, his eyes wild, burst through the garden entrance. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, his voice slurring, still drunk or drunk again. Several security guards moved toward him, but David held up a hand, stopping them to let him make a scene. It only improved our narrative. "Emily!" Ethan called out, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "This is insane. You can't marry him. This is our wedding." I turned slowly, every eye on me, and addressed him with a calm I didn't know I possessed. "Not anymore, Ethan. You made your feelings quite clear last night. And as you said, it was always just business." I allowed myself a small smile. "I've simply found a better business partner." I turned back and continued my walk toward David, ignoring Ethan's continued protests until security finally escorted him out. The ceremony itself was brief. The judge, officiating with professional efficiency, kept the proceedings moving. David and I exchanged simple vows, promises of respect and partnership, carefully worded to sound romantic to the observers while committing us to nothing more than our agreed-upon arrangement. When he slipped the ring onto my finger, a beautiful emerald-cut diamond that somehow suited my hand better than the ostentatious rock Ethan had given me, our eyes met briefly. Something passed between us, an acknowledgement of the absurdity and audacity of what we were doing. Then he smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, and I found myself smiling back. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the judge announced, and the crowd erupted in applause. Hesitant at first, then building as the guests embraced the unexpected drama of it all. David took my hand and led me back down the aisle, both of us maintaining perfectly composed expressions despite the whispers that followed us in our wake as we reached the end of the aisle. He leaned close to my ear, his voice low. "Ready for the reception?" he asked quietly. I squeezed his hand in response. "Absolutely," I whispered back. "The show's just getting started." I moved into David's penthouse the day after our wedding. His driver collected my essential belongings from the apartment I'd shared with Ethan, a task completed with military precision. While Ethan was reportedly meeting with his family's lawyers, David's team made sure everything was in place. The penthouse occupied the top floor of a sleek downtown building that David's company had developed, a fact he mentioned casually as he showed me around. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city skyline. The furnishings were understated but clearly expensive, and there wasn't a single personal photograph or memento in sight. It was beautiful, impeccably designed, and utterly impersonal, much like our marriage. "You'll have the east wing," David explained, leading me down a hallway. "Your own bedroom, bathroom, and study. I've had the closets expanded to accommodate your things. The spaces were lovely, all soft grays and blues, nothing like the masculine darkness of the main living areas. Did you research my favorite colors? I asked, half joking. He shrugged, the hint of a smile playing at his lips. I had my assistant call your assistant. This arrangement will only work if you're comfortable here, he added, his tone surprisingly thoughtful for someone who had married me purely for business and revenge. The first week passed in a strange parallel existence. During the day, I worked remotely from my new study, fielding concerned calls from colleagues and friends who'd either attended the wedding or heard about the dramatic switch. David left early and returned late, our paths rarely crossing except for carefully orchestrated public appearances. Dinner at a restaurant where Ethan's friends might see us, a charity gala where we posed for photographs, looking appropriately newlywed. In private, we were cordial strangers, maintaining polite distance. I found myself studying him when he wasn't looking, how he absent-mindedly ran his hand through his hair when reading, his habit of making notes on paper rather than digitally, how he always asked if I needed anything before he left for the day. The fallout from our wedding was spectacular. Ethan made a public statement claiming I had been unfaithful with David for months, which only made him look more pathetic when several guests confirmed his drunken confession at the rehearsal dinner. The Matthews stock took a significant hit as investors questioned the stability of the company's leadership. David's team leaked details of the attempted hostile takeover, timing the revelation perfectly to coincide with the Matthews Group's quarterly earnings call. Financial analysts began circling like sharks, questioning whether the merger prospects had been artificially inflating Matthews' market position. Meanwhile, David and I played our parts to perfection, presenting a united front of newfound business and personal partnership. It was being discussed on 3 different business news channels by the time I came home one evening. David commented one night, about 3 weeks after the wedding, as he found me in the kitchen attempting to cook dinner, a skill I'd never mastered but suddenly felt compelled to work on, perhaps to add some normalcy to our bizarre situation. He leaned against the counter, loosening his tie. The consensus seems to be that Ethan was using you for your family connections and Asian market expertise, but accidentally drove you right into the arms of his biggest competitor. I couldn't help but smile as I stirred the pasta sauce. I'm almost certainly ruining it. And what about us? He asked, his gaze sharp. What's the verdict on the Carson-Hawthorne merger? David reached past me for a wine glass, his arm briefly brushing mine. These small accidental touches had become strangely significant in our touch-starved arrangement. Apparently, we're either madly in love or I'm a calculated opportunist who swooped in to steal my rival's pride, he said, pouring himself a glass of red wine, then offering me one with a raised eyebrow. I nodded, a wry smile tugging at my lips. No one seems to consider that both things could be true. Later that night, we sat on opposite ends of the sofa, reviewing separate work documents but sharing the same space for the first time without it being for show. Why did you never marry? I asked, suddenly blurting out the question before I could think better of it. David looked up, surprised. That's very personal for fake spouses who barely know each other. But there was no edge to his words. I shrugged. We're living together. Seems like something I should know. He was quiet for so long that I thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter than usual. Never found someone worth spending my life for. The Hawthorne Group has always been my priority. He studied me for a moment, then added, Why did you agree to marry Ethan in the first place? You must have had other options. It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself since that fateful rehearsal dinner. He seemed perfect on paper, I said, holding my wine glass between my fingers. Ambitious, successful, from a good family. My parents approved. I was 31, watching all my friends settle down, and I think I convinced myself that companionate marriage based on mutual goals was enough. I gave a bitter laugh. Ironic that I ended up in exactly that kind of marriage anyway, just with a different strategic partner. 6 weeks into our arrangement, things began to shift. It started with a crisis at Hawthorne Hotels, a data breach that threatened both guest information and proprietary development plans. David came home looking more stressed than I'd ever seen him, his usually composed demeanor cracking as he paced the living room. I watched him, feeling a strange sense of concern for someone I'd married for all the wrong reasons. Without thinking, I poured him a scotch and sat him down. "Tell me about it," I said, setting the glass in front of him. David glanced at the drink, then at me. "It's bad," he muttered. "The breach is worse than we thought. Sensitive data is out in the wild. The competition will have a field day with this." I nodded, understanding the implications. My background in financial security made me well equipped to handle the situation. "We need to control the narrative, get ahead of it before it hits the press. How many clients have been affected?" David ran a hand through his hair, clearly agitated. "The number is still growing. If the investors get wind of this before we stabilize things, it could be catastrophic." We worked together late into the night, huddled over his laptop, mapping out a response strategy. We debated over the wording of a press release, coordinated with the legal team, and made decisions that would, in the long run, help salvage the company's reputation. We barely spoke in the hours that followed. It was a kind of silent understanding, both of us knowing the weight of what was at stake. We ordered late-night takeout, our voices rising and falling as we bounced ideas off each other. There was an easy rhythm between us now, a kind of mutual respect I hadn't anticipated when we'd first entered into this arrangement. By dawn, we had a comprehensive plan in place to address both the security concerns and the potential market impact. David leaned back in his chair, exhaustion written across his face. "We make a good team," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. I nodded, too tired to argue. "Better than I expected?" David looked at me for a moment, his blue eyes unreadable. "Maybe there's a reason beyond revenge that you suggested this arrangement," he said quietly. His words hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. I was too tired to process them fully, but for the first time, I found myself questioning the nature of our relationship. The next morning, I woke to find David had already left for the office, but he'd made coffee and left a note thanking me for my help. It was a small gesture, but somehow it felt significant. It felt like a turning point. That evening, when he returned, he brought dinner from my favorite restaurant, one I'd never mentioned to him. "Your assistant again?" I asked, amused. David shook his head. "I pay attention." We ate together in the kitchen, discussing the breach resolution and other business matters. But there was a new undercurrent to our conversation, an unexpected warmth that hadn't been there before. Something had shifted between us. We weren't just partners in business anymore. There was something else, something neither of us had been looking for. As the days passed, I found myself drawing closer to David, not just because of the shared responsibility we now carried, but because of the subtle way he had started to show care for me. Small acts of kindness that didn't feel calculated. And yet, every time I caught myself feeling something deeper than I should, I pushed it aside, afraid of what it might mean for this arrangement. The situation with Ethan escalated in the meantime. A financial journal published an insider exposé questioning the legitimacy of our marriage. The article strongly implied that our union was a sham designed purely to undermine Matthew's interests. The anonymous sources claimed we maintained separate bedrooms and had a prenuptial agreement specifying a 1-year term. All true, of course, but damaging to the narrative we'd created. David was furious when he read the article. "He's desperate," he said, pacing the length of the penthouse. "But this could have serious implications for investor confidence in both our companies if people believe our partnership is temporary and fraudulent." I watched him, struck by how invested I had become in protecting not just my reputation, but his as well. We'd been playing a game, sure, but now it was starting to feel like something more, and I wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a dangerous one. We'll have to convince them it's not, I said, my voice steady. We'll have to show them we're in this for the long haul. David stopped pacing and looked at me, his expression softening. Understanding seemed to dawn on him. That would require a significant adjustment to our arrangement, he said carefully. I met his gaze, unwavering. I'm aware, I replied. The tension between us had been building for weeks, neither of us willing to acknowledge it. But now, faced with a direct threat, we could no longer ignore the shift in our dynamic. If we're going to do this, I said, taking a deep breath, we should be clear about what this is. Are we still just business partners, David, or has this become something else? His answer didn't come in words, but in action. He crossed the room in 2 strides and kissed me. His hand cupped my face with surprising gentleness. When we pulled apart, I saw it in his eyes, an acknowledgement that what we had been pretending to be had evolved into something neither of us had expected. We might need to renegotiate the terms of our arrangement, he said quietly. I smiled, the first real smile I'd had in days, feeling the weight of the decision settle into my bones. I think you might be right. The next morning, I woke to a strange new atmosphere in the penthouse. The usual emptiness seemed to have faded away. David was at the kitchen counter, making coffee, a task I never imagined he would do. His presence in the space was different now, more familiar, less calculated. You didn't have to make coffee, I said, still half asleep as I stepped into the kitchen. I could have done it. David looked up, his expression soft. I wanted to, he replied simply. Figured I'd return the favor. I smiled, unable to stop it. For all our differences, there was something undeniable about the way we were starting to work together, not just as partners in a strategic game, but as something more tangible, something real. The phone rang, cutting the moment short. David answered it immediately, his tone shifting as soon as he heard the voice on the other end. Yes, I'll be there in 20, he said before hanging up. That was the board. We need to get ahead of the fallout from yesterday's article. There's a meeting in an hour. You coming with me? I hesitated. A few weeks ago, I would have said no without thinking. But now, things were different. I'll go, I said, my voice steady. I'm not hiding anymore. David's eyes met mine, and for the first time, there was no pretense between us. He nodded, clearly approving of my decision. Good. We arrived at the Hawthorne offices just in time for the board meeting. The room was tense, filled with the usual corporate politeness masking the anxiety underneath. Everyone knew the stakes, and no one was saying the things they all wanted to say. David and I took our seats at the head of the table. I could feel the weight of the room's eyes, me, their unspoken judgment and curiosity. But I didn't flinch, not this time. The conversation quickly turned to the article. We need to control the narrative, one of the board members said, glancing at David. If the public believes this marriage is a sham, they'll lose confidence in everything. Our investors, our partners, our clients. David was silent for a moment, his fingers steepled in front of him as he thought. What's the damage to Matthews so far? He asked. The financial advisor on the board quickly provided an update. Their stock dropped 15% after the article hit. The investors are nervous. They're asking questions. David nodded slowly, then turned to me. Emily, any thoughts? I hadn't expected to be called upon so soon, but this was my field. I think we should act fast, I said, my voice steady. We need to show the investors that we're in this for the long haul. We release a joint statement, not just a press release, something personal. We have to look like a united front, like this marriage is a strategic move that benefits both of us, not just Hawthorne. The room went quiet as everyone absorbed my suggestion. David's eyes flicked over to me, a hint of approval in his gaze. I think that's a good idea, he said after a long pause. We spent the next hour drafting the statement, carefully balancing sincerity with the cold, calculated truth of our arrangement. By the time we left the meeting, we had a plan in place to get ahead of the media storm. The statement would go live within hours, and we would make sure it was delivered with the kind of certainty that would silence the critics. That evening, after another long day of strategizing, David and I found ourselves alone again in the penthouse. The atmosphere between us had shifted completely. No longer tense, but comfortable. It felt like we were slowly becoming something more than we had ever expected. David poured 2 glasses of wine and handed one to me. "To the new business partnership," he said, his voice quiet. I took the glass, clinking it gently against his. "To the new business partnership," I echoed, though something in my chest tightened at the sound of the words. They didn't feel as hollow as they once did. David sat down across from me, his expression unreadable. He watched me for a moment, then spoke, his tone serious. "I never expected this, you know. Not like this." "Neither did I replied, staring down at my glass. The weight of the last few weeks was beginning to settle in, and I wasn't sure how I felt about it anymore. But here we are. David leaned back in his chair, studying me with a look that seemed almost introspective. "Do you think it's still just business, Emily? Or has it become something else?" I didn't answer immediately. I wasn't sure what the answer was, but as I looked at him, I realized I no longer had a simple answer to that question. Things were changing between us, and I wasn't sure where it was going. But I knew one thing. Whatever it wasn't just business anymore. The next few days passed in a haze of meetings, calls, and strategizing. The joint statement we'd released had done its job. The media attention shifted, the public's concerns over the legitimacy of our marriage began to subside, and Ethan's public meltdown was all but forgotten. For the first time since our wedding, I could breathe without the weight of the world on my shoulders. But there was a subtle change between David and me. We were still playing the game, still presenting ourselves as a power couple, a merger of both business and personal interests. But there was an unspoken understanding that something had shifted between us. The lines were starting to blur. One evening, after a long day of meetings, I found myself standing on the balcony of the penthouse, staring out over the city. The lights below seemed endless, a sprawling network of lives and stories, each one as complex and tangled as mine felt right now. David joined me silently, leaning against the railing beside me. His presence was so familiar now, yet still so new. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice quiet. I shook my head, not turning to look at him. "No, just thinking." "About the takeover?" he asked, his voice still calm, even though I could sense the weight of the recent crisis still hanging over him. "Not really," I said, glancing at him. "About everything. About us." David didn't respond at first. He studied me, his eyes searching before he spoke. Again. "I know this wasn't part of the plan, but do you think that it could be more than just business?" His question hung in the air, heavier than I expected it to be. I hadn't thought about it in those terms, at least not in any serious way. But as I stood there, looking out over the city, I realized that things were different now. There was a new understanding between us, one that wasn't entirely strategic. "I think it could be," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't expect it, but yeah, I think it could be." David's lips curled into a small smile, though there was still a trace of uncertainty in his expression. He leaned closer, his hand brushing mine in the darkness. It wasn't a move for show, nor was it calculated. It felt genuine. "I didn't expect this either," he said quietly, his voice almost soft. "But I'm not complaining." Neither was I. The next few days brought more work, more appearances, and more carefully crafted moments for the press. But behind the scenes, things were beginning to evolve. The merger of our companies had become more than just a financial alliance. It had, in many ways, become a merging of our lives, whether we were willing to admit it or not. One night, as I was reviewing documents in my study, I noticed David standing in the doorway, watching me silently. "Everything okay?" I asked, glancing up at him. "Yeah," he said, stepping into the room. wanted to talk. About us. I set my pen down and turned my full attention to him. There was something different in the way he looked at me now, less guarded, more open. About us, I echoed, unsure of where this conversation was going. David took a deep breath, clearly hesitating. I know we've been playing this game for a while now, the media, the board, everyone, expecting us to be this perfect couple. But I need to know, are we still playing, or are we actually real? His question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on the external pressures, on the world watching us, that I hadn't stopped to think about what was really happening between us. But now, looking at David, really looking at him, I realized that the lines between business and personal had indeed blurred. It was no longer just about strategy or manipulation. I think we're real, I said slowly, finding my voice. Maybe not in the way we expected, but real in the way that matters. Real in the way we've come to understand each other. David stepped closer, his presence filling the space between us. I agree, he said, his voice low, sincere. I think it's real too. And in that moment, I realized that our relationship had evolved into something I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about taking down Ethan or securing a business deal. It was about something deeper, something neither of us had been looking for, but that had emerged between us anyway. David reached out, his hand gently cupping my cheek. The touch was soft, a subtle promise that things between us were changing, but in a way that felt right. And as I leaned into him, I knew that whatever happened next, we were no longer just partners in a strategic game. We were something more. The days that followed were filled with subtle changes. We continued to fulfill our public roles as a married couple, attending events, smiling for the cameras, and making joint statements to the press. But behind closed doors, things between David and me were no longer just about business. The boundaries had blurred, and neither of us could deny it anymore. One evening, about a month after our wedding, I was sitting in the study, going through the latest reports on Hawthorne Hotel's stock performance. My mind was too full of numbers and graphs to focus on much else, but something inside me shifted when I heard the sound of David's footsteps approaching. "Emily," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight I hadn't heard before. "We need to talk." I looked up at him, my heart racing. It was the kind of serious tone that made me put my papers down and focus on him completely. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice steady, but my insides knotted with anticipation. David hesitated for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. Then he took a step closer, his eyes locked on mine. "I can't keep pretending that this is just business anymore, that what we have is just a convenient arrangement." I froze, unsure of what to say. The truth was, I'd been feeling the same way. I'd been avoiding admitting it to myself, but everything had changed between us and I couldn't ignore it any longer. "You're right," I said quietly. "It's not just business anymore. It never really was. But I think we both knew that from the start, didn't we?" David nodded, his expression softening. "I didn't expect to feel like this," he admitted, taking another step toward me. "I never planned on this. But I think I care about you, Emily. I think I'm falling for you." The words hung in the air, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. Falling for him? It felt like an impossibility. But as I looked into his eyes, I realized that it was no longer just about strategy, and it was no longer just about revenge on Ethan. There was something real here, something more than we had bargained for. "I think I'm falling for you, too," I whispered, almost afraid to admit it aloud. David's face softened, and he took a step closer, his hand reaching out to gently touch mine. The gesture was simple, but it felt like a promise that whatever had begun as a business arrangement had become something much deeper. "I don't want to lose this," David said quietly. "I don't want to lose what we have, whatever it is." I met his gaze, my heart racing with a mix of fear and anticipation. "Neither do I replied, my voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside me. but we can't pretend it's just business anymore. We have to face whatever this is, together." David nodded, his hand gently brushing my cheek. "Together," he repeated, his voice full of quiet resolve. "Let's see where this goes." And for the first time since our marriage had been turned into a strategic power move, I felt the weight of all our decisions shift. The game we had been playing had changed. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about something more, profound, more human. And as we stood there in the quiet of the study, I realized that we had crossed a line that neither of us could go back from. We weren't just partners in business. We were partners in something much more complicated, much more meaningful. And for the first time in months, I felt like I had no idea what the future would hold, but I wasn't afraid of it. The weeks that followed felt like a dream, a whirlwind of changes, emotions, and decisions we never expected to face. David and I had crossed a line, one that neither of us had anticipated. But as the days passed, I found myself more and more at ease in our new reality, no longer questioning the depth of our connection. We continued to navigate the world as the Hawthorne-Carson power couple. But now, when the cameras turned off and the boardroom doors closed, there was something more between us than just business. There was trust. There was warmth. And for the first time, I could feel myself letting go of the armor I had worn for so long. One morning, as I sat at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee, David walked in, his usual composure gone. His hair was a little messy, his tie slightly askew, and there was a look in his eyes that made my heart race. "Emily," he said, his voice lower than usual. "I've been thinking a lot about everything, about us." I put my coffee down, my heart picking up its pace. "What's going on?" David hesitated for a moment, then walked over to me, his steps slow but purposeful. "I think we've been given a chance," he said, his eyes locking with mine. "A chance to create something real, something beyond what we thought was possible. And I want to take that chance with you." I couldn't help but smile, the words catching me off guard. But as I looked at him, truly looked at him, I knew that this was no longer just a marriage of convenience. It was no longer a business deal. We had both let go of the masks we had worn to survive, and what had emerged was something raw, something real. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" I asked, my voice shaky with emotion. David smiled, a small, genuine smile that made my heart flutter. "I think I'm saying that I love you, Emily. I don't know how we got here, but I know that I want to stay here, with you." I felt a rush of warmth spread through me. It was everything I had been afraid to hope for. And yet, as I stood there, staring into David's eyes, I realized that this, what we had found, was worth all the risk, all the uncertainty. "I love you too," I whispered, unable to stop the tears that threatened to fall. "I don't know where we go from here, but I know I want to go there with you." David reached out and pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly as if we were both trying to prove that this wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was real. It was ours. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to believe it. We stood there for a long time, in the quiet of the morning, knowing that the world outside would always try to label us, to put us in boxes that we didn't fit. But in that moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was that we had built something together, something unexpected, something that had evolved from business into love. And whatever the future held, I knew one thing for sure: it would be ours to create, together.